Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for hanging in there this afternoon. Always a pleasure to be at any of the events that Sid and Steve run. And this will be a little bit of a change of pace for you, I think. What we're going to do is I'm going to share with you a presentation or parts of a presentation that I gave back a few months ago as part of the IWSR and the investment banking community that was asking if, from MHW's perspective, if we could talk about trends over the next 5 to 10 years in this industry. And obviously, whether it's bulk wine or bottled wine, you'll see throughout this presentation that I've never been more bullish on this industry. Steve mentioned my time in the industry. I'm in it about 35 years now. So I've seen a lot of changes over all that time and was following the industry actually even before that while back in college. But quickly, what I really want to say, in the end of the day, it comes down to simply this, that in the years that I've been here, there's never been a more opportunistic time to be associated with the industry. And it's at every single level, whether you're a producer, a brand owner, whether you're one of the support services within the industry, and the growth is phenomenal. And it doesn't look like any time within the next 5 to 10 years it's going to slow. If anything, it'll continue to build. Here's the agenda quickly. I'm going to talk a little bit about who we are so that you understand the perspective that I bring is one that is based on really, I guess, our approach and what we've seen. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. And why do I think the future is as bright as I say? I'll talk about that. And then give you just an inside, sort of a sneak inside view of how MHW sees things as they happen real time. This will be looking back at over maybe a 6-month period, because we're seeing some very unique trends. We tend to see things first, oftentimes a little bit ahead of when some of the major reporting systems start getting information out. And then some of the other, I would say, areas that could impact items or issues that could impact my forecast. We'll talk about that. Just by way of background, Steve mentioned our corporation, MHW, goes back to 1934, right after Prohibition. And it was formerly called Mashur-on-Ree Wines, and for many, many years, it was owned by PepsiCo. Some of you may know the story of Nixon and Khrushchev and Pepsi getting an opportunity to go into the Soviet Union. And through President Nixon, this opportunity came up where Pepsi could sell Pepsi concentrate into the Soviet Union. And for that, they had to create something to take out that they can convert to cash. And they actually created Stolichnaya vodka. And that was the beginning of an amazing boom for vodka, because prior to Stoli, there was basically all domestic vodkas being consumed in America. Then Absolut came along and things changed. 1994, Pepsi gets an amazing deal. They sell the rights to Stoli to Grand Met. And it was at that time we reorganized a company and became a service distribution platform for new brands. That was the idea, anticipating that there would be an explosion of new brands coming. And I would probably say to you that any explosion we thought was coming would never have been as big as what actually came. I think we underestimated it. And that there would be this demand for new brands. So that's what we've been doing for the last 22 years, is helping a lot of these brands get into America. And we provide this platform. A lot of it is technology driven. And over these 20 years, we've touched over 25,000 products across wine, spirits, and beer. Work with some of the larger companies have actually, while our bread and butter may be helping new brands come in, some of the large brands at different times have tapped into MHW's system because of its efficiency and other things. These would be examples of brands, for example, that came through the system and then went on to different things. But if you look over to the right, for example, Tequila Avion, Pernod Ricard, that started with us, and they paid a nice multiple for that. Skinny Girl Margarita, Bulldog Gin, that was Campari last year. You might have seen that acquisition. Milagro Tequila. Presidente Beer, AB InBev acquired that one. We'll talk in a few minutes. Leblon, for example, that's a Bacardi acquisition. So that's what's happening. The industry, as I said, quite exciting. And here's what we see over the next five years. If you look to the left on beer, I don't know how many beer folks we have in here, but it's important to note that the beer industry is about 3 billion cases. Wine is about 340 million, as most of you know, wine people, and then spirits about 220 million. Interestingly, since 2010, beer Just if I told you 10 years ago that beer would lose 300 million cases, which is larger than the whole spirits category by a lot and almost as big as the wine, that's what they lost in 10 years. And you say, where did all that go? Because if you look at the slides, I mean, 16 going out to 21, what's happening is the beer, obviously crafts are way up in beer. We know that. They represent about 10% of that category now, and also imports continue to grow on the beer side. But if you look over at wine and spirits, we're running at about, historically we've run on wine 2 to 3% in the last 4 or 5 years. We were at 4 to 5. Steve remembers us doing presentations back in 2007 when wine was running at 4 to 5% every year. So we're going to get back to that, I think, in the coming years. But the point is, while a 2% growth rate, or 2.5 in wine and 2.5 in spirits, what's going on inside of those numbers or those graphs are quite dynamic. Picture now, in the last 5 years, a brand like Bacardi has lost 1.2 million cases in a category that's been relatively flat, maybe a little bit down. And so you've got a lot of changes going on with other brands coming in. Same thing, a brand like an Absolut, during that same period, 5 years, they lose 600,000 cases, but vodka is up 2 to 3% every year. So other brands are coming in, and that's why you see this explosion of new players coming in and thinking they can get some share. Same thing with a Grey Goose. They could lose in 5 years. I think they've lost about 300,000 cases. So you'll see what pressure that puts on, because now those big companies, as you know, are out there in acquisition mode, right? They've got to make up for those losses, and it's not easy to get the growth on those bigger brands. So they're out there paying tremendous multiples, and we'll talk about that as well. I say a lot of this because the people that are in this room that are that involved, whether you're a brand owner or what have you, you've got to be loving what's going on in this, this industry right now, between valuations and activity, as I said, employment and everything. And I have called this, over the last 2 years, I've called this the perfect storm, at least in the history of beverage alcohol, where so many things are coming together. And why do I say that? Well, I see the next 5 to 10 years with these kind of growth rates, 3.5% for spirits, at least 2 for wine. And if beer can hold flat or up 0.5 point at 3 billion cases, it's tremendous activity. You also see, and you know this, your state is doing it. Our home state, New York, is very, very active here, but the federal and state government recognizes the impact of beverage alcohol and the benefits it can bring to revenue. And as long as they're doing a great job on protecting the public, then they're looking for ways to help mid to small sized businesses. So we see it in New York, where the governor has been personally very active in helping establish rules and regulations, tax benefits, opportunities for sampling and things like that have been unprecedented. You also know, I just talked about the big industry players are all over the place looking for new brands that are maybe at that 10, 20, 30, 50,000 case level, and want to pick those off, pay big multiples for them. And the valuations have never been higher and are just on this trajectory that almost doesn't make sense anymore. Trade members and regulators, I've said this before, we as an industry, I think, are doing a pretty good job. We've got to always improve in it, but staying vigilant when it comes to social responsibility, making sure that the under 21s are protected. More and more good things are happening there, and I think that bodes well. And our market against the rest of the world, we have a growing 21 plus. There's millions joining it every year. I think every day it's a couple of million. So it's really, as I said, an opportune time to be jumping in on it. Other things, the economic multiplier impact. Every time a new brand is created or a new company is developed, and they go out and they get licenses, and they got to get a PR firm, and they've got to get an attorney, and they've got to get someone to do this or that, well, obviously that's creating jobs. And all of those sectors are being positively affected: production, marketing, advertising, and all of it. But obviously there's the biggest, I guess, roadblock or challenge we have is still distribution. And that never seems to get easy, but a lot of solutions are in process. And technology today is changing the game. Back maybe 15, 20 years ago, without the technology you see today, the distribution challenges were much more formidable. Today, and we'll talk about that in a moment, better options to get around some of that. All the consumer trends are very, very positive. You all know this, but again, this is one of the most important, I think, statistics out there, that 40% of the millennials are drinking across all the categories, and oftentimes in the same evening or at the same event. And then you know about the blurring across category lines. This is very important, flavorization. Most recently, you saw it with vodka. You've seen it even with wines. In some cases, you're seeing it with beer. But clearly now whiskey is seeing the benefits of flavorization. And obviously, Hispanics, millennials, and women are impacting our industry to an incredible degree. And premiumization across all categories continues. No let up there, for sure. When we look at some of, Nielsen always does a good job of tracking what millennials are saying and doing, but the most important one to me is that one about challenges, when I talk about challenges for the big brands. You know, keeping a millennial today focused on your brand for more than a couple of years is very, very difficult, sometimes even a couple of months. And so that's the challenge for the big players, but also the opportunity for the newer brands. Get in front of them. Celebrities are impacting brands now at a level we've never seen before. You probably all read about Clooney and Casamigos. So that's an MHW client that we service. And you see a valuation, we'll see that in a moment, that's off the charts like that. What it'll likely do is bring more, I think, celebrities to the game that'll think that social media, it's not going to be easy to ever replicate what they did, but others will, I'm sure, give it a shot. But you look over, Kenny Chesney is doing a remarkable job. It's one of the hottest rums in the rum category right now is Blue Chair Bay, and a lot of it has to do with his position and the brand. Ciroc, you probably all know that story as well. Ace of Spades on the champagne with Jay-Z, also an incredible success. And we service a lot of these brands, so we actually see them from start to finish, and we do see what kind of impact a celebrity doing it the right way can have. Obviously, in terms of distribution and penetration and retail and so forth, some of these home delivery services that really didn't exist 5-6 years ago are having a tremendous impact today. You know about the craft movement. I don't think I need to say much about this. There's been that explosion. You look at the percentage growth across all of these. California obviously is the leading craft distiller with the small craft distillers in the country with almost 200. And so incredible changes there. Quickly turning over to brand valuations to give you an idea. We talked before about Casamigos. That would be the latest one from just a couple of weeks ago. That number is $700 million with $300 on an earnout on performance. And so that, when we look at multiples like revenue or EBITDA or what we call an annual case multiple, that one seems to have broken through a ceiling that I'm not sure we ever thought could exist. So they're creating a ceiling that we don't know how high is up on that. But anyway, you look through some of these recent ones, a High West, that one you may recall reading, that sold for $160 million on a brand that was doing 70,000 cases. I think right here in Napa, very recently, Schrader wines, right? That sold for $60 million, and it does about 2,500 to 3,000 cases. So when you look at these multiples, you say, wow, boy, don't you want to be associated in some capacity with those. Deep Eddy. So it goes on, but we track these brands, and nothing is going south. It's all north in big ways. Obviously, on the beer side, craft breweries are getting scooped up at a record level as well. New licenses, just look at over the period from 2008 to 15, the amount of breweries, wineries, distillers, and even importers. We now have 14,000 importers licensed in the United States. Now, granted, a lot of them are not that active. Many of them are very small, but it's an indication of folks trying to step in and fill what they think is a void. They see this demand by the consumers for new and unique, and people are flooding in to try to satisfy that. Current wholesalers approaches 30,000. Probably 1/3 of those are what I would call active or very profitable. And then the cola growth, this always amazes me. On an average year, the TTB down in Washington is handling well over 150,000 new labels a year. Now, granted, some of those are original labels that have been modified slightly, but still, it's some huge. And this would be, that's 15, 16, I've seen the numbers at growth year again, so 14 consecutive years on that as well. And the TTB, this shows you what they're expecting in the next 5 to 10 years. They actually added, right before Trump got in, they were able to add 23 headcount in formula and label approvals. all in anticipation of what's coming in the United States. So quite impressive. Good for them to get out in front of it. Then you look at retail outlets. In the last 10 years, we're up over 90,000 in retail outlets covering wine, spirits, and beer. And you can see how they break down on those outlets. And more are coming. You'll start to see that speed up. You know, a lot of the fast food players have entered the wine space, the beer space, and you'll see more of that in the future. Different approaches. I won't go through all of these, recognizing we have time constraints here, but when people look to the United States, there are different approaches. Obviously, getting one of the bigger players is very difficult, but oftentimes they'll be the first one to knock on your door when your brand is doing well to buy that brand. There's a lot of mid-size, I showed you numbers, mid-size and smaller players. You just, again, have to do a good vetting process to make sure if you hand your brand to someone like that it's in good hands. So typically you check on their history and also existing brands and what they've done for them. Steve mentioned licensed companies like MHW. Since we started that model about 22 years ago, I'd say in the last 6, 7 years, there's probably been 10, 15 companies that are doing similar services. So there's plenty of players out there that can assist. Obviously, if you're a domestic player and you want to get involved, you've got to get a federal permit, you've got to get your home state license. But you can then outsource a lot of the national distribution. Plenty of local craft players out there. Obviously, it's not that difficult to establish your own entities today. And then, of course, different ways that people get to market. I like mine, I often talk about the reverse tier marketing with private labels and so forth, where suppliers or players, even small players, are able to, through a contact, get linked with a major chain and then backfill the distribution, finding a wholesaler in the various markets to help them get that product to the retailer. One challenge remains, and it's something that we all have to deal with every day, is the fact that for wine and spirits, 75% and maybe going up to close to 80% in the coming years, the top 10 guys are handling that activity. And that does represent a challenge. And so the next tier down really have to step up. And I think they're doing that. We see a lot of beer wholesalers now that are jumping into wine and spirits. Their sales reps are getting more acclimated to how to sell products, especially when they have to sell a craft beer. It becomes more plausible for them to come in and talk about selling a craft spirit or a craft wine, or a wine for that matter. So you're getting what I call the hybrid salespeople today as well. And so other distribution considerations, lots of different ways. I talked about beer, the new wholesalers, direct to consumer. Obviously, we're in the hotbed of it right here in California, but that growth seems to be never ending. If they start to mirror what's going on in Europe, if they're at 4 to 5, 6%, that could get to 10% in the coming years pretty easily. There is a point, I don't know how many importers are here, but of course the direct shipping is working very well for the domestic wineries, but the imported wines and the foreign wineries are getting, I hate to use this word, screwed, because obviously there's no direct shipping from overseas, and the only answer is eventually to have an importer represent effectively the winery and share the opportunity that the California and other domestic wineries have today. So that's being worked on, you can imagine, in trade talks going on between countries, because the EU is very concerned about it right now. If trends continue and direct shipping continues at the rates right now, then the market share for imports is going to drop at a serious level in the next 10 to 20 years. And then again, I talked about states looking for ways to accommodate folks. I'll show you real quick at MHW, because we are in front of these new brands coming in. Here's a quick look at countries and, as I said, over the last 6 months, where certain products and types of products are coming from, just going through very, very quickly, where in the world. And so we do see these trends. And what's unique about it is oftentimes it's not always the consumer that drives the trend, obviously. Oftentimes it's how well a brand or a country starts to really work the US market and then creates a demand. A great case in point, we were involved with working with the Mexican government a few years ago on mezcal. 5 years ago, a lot of people didn't know what mezcal was. Today, a lot of people, most people would know something about it because of the work the government has done, and also eventually these small brands that came in have made their way to some large importers. So again, just giving you indications of where in the world. Today we import from about 86 countries, including a lot of US. We handle a lot of US products as well. But again, the goal here is just to show you the world is focused heavily on America and the American consumer, and always for good reason. And the American consumer is quickly learning, and it's very easy for them to research products via the internet or travel or whatever they may do. So during this period, as I said, in 16 in the United States, during that same period coming from various places. As far as considerations that could impact what I've just told you and all this optimism that I have, obviously one thing we got to keep an eye on, big box retailer growth is great, but at a certain point, we have to be a little careful there. When I say careful, I'm talking about those that are considering bringing new brands into the system. As big box retailer growth continues on the pace it is right now, it is going to take a certain amount of share that used to be out there for newer products. And so there's a certain balance you sort of want to keep. And I'm not sure what that exact number is yet. But I've seen what's happened over in the UK and other parts of the world, and it can be problematic to say the least. And so my sense in America, at least, is that we will find the happy medium, a happy balance, because I think consumers, especially in the larger cities, the New Yorks, the Chicago, LAs, and so forth, they're not necessarily all shopping at big box retailers. That really isn't accessible to them. And so I think that'll be one of the things that'll keep it in check. Direct to consumer, I think, is going to continue to grow. I also feel that in time, let's face it, if marijuana is going to be legal in many states, the concept of shipping a $60, $70, $80 craft spirit to a consumer in another state, as long as the taxes are tracked properly and so forth, that doesn't seem unreasonable to me. So I think at some point you'll see direct shipping affect spirits. And I also think beer along the way too. There's a lot of high-end crafts where the cost of delivery wouldn't be so bad. Marijuana, clearly everyone's watching that here in California. I haven't seen statistics, but I know the Cowen Group, their latest research for Colorado, Washington, and Oregon that they publish says that the one area that is showing impact is on beer. If you take Miller, Coors, and Bud, they're down about 6.5%, 7% last year. And they're saying a lot of that was I hate to say cannibalized by cannabis, but that's basically what happened there. So marijuana is something to keep an eye on. Technology, obviously huge, changing this industry every day. I was looking out, when you look at who's in development of the cars, basically the automated cars, driverless cars, if you go out 10, 12 years ago and you think about the impact that's going to have on the beverage alcohol industry, it's potentially quite significant because, and you can do the math, but if people who are out on an evening consume one extra drink because they don't have to get behind the wheel of a car, I'm just hypothetically, then you can see what the numbers you extrapolate out. So, and then the taxes and the border equalization, I'm just going to, this is a little political thing here, but Paul Ryan came out, and one of his solutions was to tax imports at 20% and to do it in a different way, not to do it as an excise tax, but to do it through the non-deductibility on a corporate tax return. And it's sort of a backdoor way of trying to get this thing accomplished. That thing is still out there. I think it would be horrific for everybody. It'll drive prices up, cause a lot of problems. It's slowed a little bit, but we'll have to see if that's the way Trump's going to build his wall on the backs of imported brands. That would be a tragedy. So if you get a chance to talk to your local congressman, keep that one top of mind. Maybe California wineries would be happy to see it happen. And on social responsibility, the most important aspect of the whole presentation is that the industry has to continue to stay vigilant on that, as I mentioned before. And if it continues to do that, I mean, the numbers are still terrible, anybody that dies, but we got to keep getting the numbers down and protecting the under 21. I have 4 of them, or have had them come through the system, so I'm very conscious of that. And I think we are all doing each year a little bit better, but there's still plenty of room. I don't know if I have time for any questions, but take any. Otherwise, I appreciate your attention very much. All right. Oh, okay. Now, next up, I get to work with this gentleman and his company quite often. This is Tom Beaufort from JF Hillebrand on how to, he's going to be speaking on how to optimize shipments of bulk wine and spirits and to save money. And I can't think, to be honest, I can't think of anybody more qualified in the world to talk about this than the guy that runs Hillebrand. So here he is. Thank you again very much.